Now, Module 8 is our last module for Chapter 11. What we're going to focus on here is something called a midlife crisis, and then some different phases of retirement. So let's go ahead and first tackle midlife crisis. And so the midlife crisis is based on Levinson and his idea of life structures. And so basically, he says we have an overall pattern of life that reflects person's priorities and relationships with other people and kind of the larger society that we can kind of describe someone's life. And that this is consists of two different types of periods of time. You have your structure building period. This is where the person goes about kind of pursuing goals. So many of you are in a structure building time in your life because you're trying to gather enough expertise to work in a profession of your choosing that you happen to like. So, for instance, if you're a psychology major, you're hopefully gaining enough psychological knowledge to be able to go into a career related to psychology. So that's structure building, and you go through roughly about a decade period of time where you do that. So once you graduate from college, you'll probably get that first job. It'll probably lead to a next job as your overall goal, getting closer to your ideal of what you want. But at a certain point, usually about 10 years into the structure building period, you do a transitional period. And this is a period of questioning your life decisions. Is what you want to do, are you on that path? Or do you need to go ahead and change that path to do something different? And the most famous of these kind of transitional periods that Levinson talked about is that of the midlife crisis. And he said that this usually occurs between the ages of 40 to 50 years old, with the average around 46. This is where you question your entire life structure, including your career, and other unsettling questions like even your, say, spouse, your family. And so the stereotypic is the man with the midlife crisis who gets divorced from his first wife, starts dating somebody much younger than himself, gets a sports car, dyes his hair, that sort of stuff. And that's kind of your classic midlife crisis. Now, what Levinson kind of left out is that really only about 13% of people seem to go through a midlife crisis where they have real significant changes in their life. Rather, most people, when they maybe get to the midlife crisis, kind of take a look and they're satisfied with that structure building and then they continue on. So just because you go through these transitional periods doesn't mean you have to have a crisis where you really upend everything. Though I think it's interesting, they see that usually the level of self-esteem and questioning in adulthood tends to be a little bit lower in those mid to late 40s when there is this kind of transition period going on. So, age is not a perfect predictor when we talk about this midlife crisis. It really depends on a lot of life situations. It's an intriguing concept, and I think we do see this where we have a period in our life where really kind of eyes on the prize, but then we get a point, it kind of plateaus, and we question it and see if that's what we still want to continue to do, or do we devote our attentions elsewhere. And so this is Levinson's stages. You don't need to know this necessarily. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what his stages were like and what he was talking about as far as those transitions that tend to occur. And you can see the midlife transition there is towards the end of his various stages of when things are going on. And then this next slide can kind of show the vocational development and adjustment that we make. So you can see the amount of people who are in the labor force and then who get out of the labor force. So this is really just a fancy kind of slide to show when people typically retire. And you can see 65 is about the traditional retirement age, but sometimes around 60, you can see both for men and women, you really begin to see a decrease in the amount of people who are in the labor force. Of course, this is going to vary based on economic situations when people decide to retire. And of course, as people's health continues to get better, they may decide to work for longer periods of time. But you can see by the age of 75, the vast majority of men and women have retired. So that's a nice transition to our last little subject for this chapter, and that is the one of retirement. And so in phases of retirement, This is just kind of a notice of how people kind of go through these phases. And the first one is a pre-retirement phase. This is when you're nearing retirement and individuals are starting to gather information and plan for the future. Because if you can think about it, you spend most of your life, you go through school. That school is supposed to give you skills to get a job, and then you work for several decades in a job. And then you've got what after? What, hopefully, you're fortunate enough you don't have to work after you retire, that you can retire in a comfortable fashion and do whatever you want. But then again, who are you if you're not part of what you work? And some people have a difficult time with that. But the pre-retirement phase is not like that, because there's the looking forward to, because you don't have to do what you've done for so many decades now, and that's go to work. So you have a lot more freedom. And maybe all of us got a taste of that back with the pandemic, a little bit of what happens when we don't have anything to do, or that has to be immediately done. And so next you get the honeymoon phase, and that is when you actually retire in that first year or so, when you don't have to go to work anymore and you can do everything that you enjoy as much as you want. And so that's usually a pretty terrific time. Maybe you're doing all the traveling, you're writing that book you said you were always going to write, whatever it might be. The third phase is the disenchantment phase. So you get a year in, maybe you discover you don't like traveling all the time. While it was nice to kind of break up your work life, doing it all the time just wasn't as not nearly as much fun. And you may feel a bit aimless, and a lot of unhappiness comes that because we don't have a purpose necessarily. And so you can feel a little bit of drift there. But after a little while, most people are able to reorient. And that's where they begin to put together a more realistic kind of second phase of their life. Maybe they go back to work. Maybe they work in a little bit different area, or maybe they like to volunteer and decide to go volunteer some more, and kind of give back in that manner. So those are the four phases of retirement. And of course, these are going to be somewhat consistent with, your income. So if you don't have a lot of income, you may not have the luxury of the honeymoon phase where you get to do everything you enjoy, because you can't afford to do it that often. So there is this kind of idea of a mix between personality and successful aging, in particular when we talk about retirement. And there are two approaches. There's the activity theory, and this is where aging adults are going to find their lives satisfying if they can maintain that previous lifestyle and activity level. In other words, they may not be working, but they're keeping themselves busy and active. They may continue in old activities or find substitutes if they can't do the old activities anymore. And that's the idea, that you don't just fade out. You just kind of keep up the same level. You just get to reorient exactly where that activity is oriented to. And then you have disengagement theory. This is the successful aging involves kind of that withdrawal from society, and that it's kind of satisfying for both involved, society and the individual. In other words, I have a contract I made with you, society. I'm going to work several decades, and then after I'm done, I'm done. You shouldn't expect anything from me, and I'm not expecting giving anything for you. I'm just going to fade out, and that's what I want to do. And that's the disengagement theory. So it really depends on the individual, which is going to be the better theory, though. The evidence seems to lean a bit more towards the activity theory, because it just is a more engaging kind of theory where people may be a little more satisfied than with the disengagement one. But of course, it's going to depend on the environment that individual is in. So that's going to wrap up our chapter 11 on the self and personality. We've gone through the entire lifespan, really dug in to how the formation of the self and the evolution of the personality kind of morphs itself throughout the lifespan. So tune in for next chapter, and we'll go from there.